In Nigeria, commemorations are being held 10 years after the abduction of nearly 300 schoolgirls by Boko Haram. They were kidnapped by the armed group in 2014 in the northeastern town of Chibok. Some are still unaccounted for. Al Jazeera's Ahmed Idris attended the event in Chibok.
It's tough for the students who have been released. It's also tough for parents who have also been released. Right now, what's happening in this particular hall is a commemoration of the 10th anniversary of the kidnap of the school children. We're here in the government secondary school here in Chibok, and parents have been lamenting that 10 years after, many of their children are yet to come home. Right now, we're talking about 82 who are still missing. There were several speakers in this hall who stood up to demand action of the government. They were asking questions, asking pertinent questions. How come that some kidnapped victims in other parts of Nigeria have been released, yet the government was unable to secure the release of all the Chibok girls after 10 years? So those are some of the key questions being raised by people who are here.
Well, joining us now on the News Hour is Jumo Ayandele, who's visiting professor at New York University and senior Nigeria advisor for the Armed Conflict and Location and Event Data Project. Thank you very much for joining us on Al Jazeera. The capture of the Chibok girls set off, of course, as we remember, a global campaign to bring back our girls. But as we heard, many are still missing, and kidnappings in Nigeria have in fact proliferated. So what did the campaign achieve when you look at things 10 years on?
Thank you very much for having me on your segment. I would say that the campaign definitely achieved collective action in trying to pressure the Nigerian government to bring back these girls that were kidnapped by Boko Haram. Unfortunately, 10 years later, as your correspondent had noted, the parents of the remaining abducted girls have really reported that there's this lack of political commitment by the Nigerian authorities to ensure that all the girls are accounted for and or found. We have seen, unfortunately, in the last 5 years, that a lot of non-state armed groups in northern Nigeria are adopting this Boko Haram strategy of mass kidnappings, and vulnerable populations such as women and school children are particularly at risk because these mass abductions are drawing this significant domestic and international pressure as well as media attention that they need in order to press their demands to the Nigerian government.
Yeah, and just last month, we saw more than 250 school children abducted in Kaduna in the northwest. You talked about the lack of political will. I mean, do these mass kidnappings continue to plague Nigeria a decade after Chibok? It seems that kidnappings have become a business almost. Why has the Nigerian government not been able to address this issue effectively? Is it just down to a lack of political will, as you say?
The issue of kidnapping, I would say, in Nigeria, it's very complex and multifaceted. And it is because of very many interconnected challenges. So yes, we do have the economic hardships that we have seen in the country, such as unemployment and inflation and, you know, the record debt that the government is going through. But we are also seeing that the Nigerian armed forces are stretched too thin across the 6 geopolitical zones of the country. So we have in the northeast, for example, the Boko Haram insurgency. In the northwest, we have the banditry. In the south, we have piracy. So with that regards, the armed forces are stretched too thin. However, I would say this inability to tackle the kidnapping crisis is not solely the responsibility of state security forces or the military. It does reflect a broader cross-government failure that we are seeing when it comes to security response. So I would say that there is a need for a stronger collaboration between local community members and the government and security forces in really trying to encourage the synergy that is needed in building trust between citizens and the state security agencies. And this is going to be very crucial if we want to tackle the kidnapping crisis.
Right. Interesting that you talked about local communities there, Jumo, because I wanted to address that. I mean, Chibok, 270 girls kidnapped, and their lives took different turns since the abductions. Some escaped, as we know, immediately. Others were released a few years later, and many are still missing. But for those who managed to escape or to be released, what has it been like? You know, you talked about the local communities. To be a Chibok girl, I imagine, carries a lot of stigma. What has their reintegration into their communities been like?
It's been varied. In some parts of the country, in the Northeast, some of these girls have been welcomed back, and in some other parts, some of these girls have not been welcomed back. And that is the issue when it comes to the reintegration strategies that the state government is trying to implement with local communities fearing for their lives that these victims are spies for Boko Haram, especially when it has been so long that they have been found or released. So it is very, very varied. There are some girls that do not want to be reintegrated and would rather go back to their husbands in Sambisa Forest. And we're hoping that in the next couple of years that the government does something where community leaders and populations do not feel scared in embracing Boko Haram victims.
Thank you, Jumo, for talking to us. So interesting to hear your thoughts about this. Jumo Ayandele, visiting professor at NYU, joining us there from New York. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.